Hello and welcome to Groong Weekend Review for Sunday, July 19. As you may know, the major event in Armenian news this week was the renewed fighting on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, claiming tens of lives on both sides and amounting to the most extensive fighting since the April War of 2016. To help us understand what happened, during our first segment, we'll be hearing a panel discussion co-hosted by myself and Asbed Bedrosyan with our three regular guests, Asbed Kotchikian, Emil Sanamyan, and Alan Zamanyan. The rhetoric from Azerbaijan during the week escalated to an alarming level, culminating with the threat to strike Armenia's nuclear power plant using ballistic missiles. For the second segment of our show, we'll feature an excerpt from a chat we had with Areg Danagoulian, Associate Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT. We'll close out the show with a short discussion on how Armenian media reacted and covered the events on the border, trying to balance sensitive national security issues with the need to inform the public. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Around noon on Sunday, July 12, Azerbaijani forces attempted to infiltrate the Armenian border in the Tavush region of Armenia. Upon initial shots by Armenian armed forces, Azerbaijani soldiers abandoned their vehicle and retreated, only to attack the Armenian army border post again and be repulsed after suffering nearly half a dozen deaths. Later on Sunday evening, Azerbaijan started an intensive shelling along the Armenian border, and by Monday morning there were reports of drone attacks, shelling, and sniper fire. Azerbaijan also went on a PR and cyber offensive. Armenian government sites were hacked, and both Azerbaijan and Turkey were trying to pin responsibility for the fighting on Armenia. The attack was preceded by public threats to resume military action. As recently as the first week of July, Ilham Aliyev complained about the OSCE Minsk group mediators and firmly told the reporters that for Azerbaijan, the military option was on the table. Since then, the relative calm along the Armenian-Azerbaijan state border and the Azerbaijan-Artsakh line of contact has degraded, culminating in the clashes of July 12. By July 14, Azeri losses had accumulated to over a dozen, including many high-ranking officers at the major general, colonel, and major rank levels. Armenia suffered military and civilian casualties as well, including a destroyed kindergarten. During intensive fighting, Tavush residents were asked to take cover in bomb shelters for days. Now let's do a deep dive analysis with our well-informed guests. We are recording this segment on Friday morning, July 17th. Emil Sanamyan, Asbed Kotchikian, and Alan Zamanyan are with us to analyze the events of the past week. Emil, I'll start with you. You wrote about these events for the USC Institute of Armenian Studies the day after the fighting broke out. What are your thoughts about these continuing hostilities? Is this just another routine flare-up, or are there more serious reasons to be worried about here? Why the escalation now, and why on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border as opposed to the line of contact in Artsakh?
Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. I'd like to say that this was in a way a routine type of event for the Armenian-Azerbaijani confrontation over the past 2 decades since the 1994 ceasefire. Of course, it was the worst outbreak of fighting since 2016 April. But in general, you could see that the logic of this confrontation was similar to the previous confrontations, that both sides tried to keep the area of operations limited, not to expand the fighting, did not make any moves. I mean, when people talk about sort of usually Azerbaijani side looking for an excuse to launch a war, I mean, there's been plenty of you can always come up with plenty of excuses, which you can see from this situation that they didn't want to expand the fighting, and the Armenian government similarly did not want to expand the fighting. Now, people frequently ask why this is happening in Tavush and not in Artsakh. Well, if you follow the situation closely enough, I think you'd realize that much of the fighting in between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the past, I would say, 10 to 15 years has actually focused on Tavush area. Part of that has to do with the fact that the over a period of time after 1994 ceasefire, you had defense fortifications dug in through the entirety of Artsakh perimeter, whereas on the Tavush section you still had a lot of no man's land between the forces. So after Azerbaijani forces were done sort of taking the no man's land in the Artsakh stretch, they started to do it in the Tavush stretch and also in the Nakhchivan stretch. So the the idea is to sort of score small victories with moving up a little bit onto this hilltop or that hilltop, or digging a trench further down, like an additional 100 meters, 200 meters. If you look at the Google Maps, you could see the entirety of Armenian line of contact, both in Artsakh and Tavush stretches, sort of dug with a lot of trench lines, and sort of the lines getting closer together. We could talk about this particular situation in more detail, but in general, this was the outline. I think what was different, of course, is that this was a significant blow for this outcome of this confrontation was a significant blow for Azerbaijan, because senior officers were killed, and it appears that there's some disarray in Azerbaijani leadership over this, and in general over the past year. There's some question marks as to Ilham Aliyev's health and his policies, even within his own circle. So that, and of course we had the revolution in Armenia in 2018 that has also had an impact on Azerbaijan. So yes, this is a routine occurrence, but it could have non-routine consequences. Yes.
So Emil, what is your view of the situation, which the Armenian opposition blames on the government as a failure in diplomacy and lining up real friends and support?
Well, I mean, of course, it's a kind of reach for the former government people to kind of accuse the current government of not lining up sufficient support abroad. I mean, the previous government was in power for 10 years, right? So there's a legacy diplomatic infrastructure and legacy organizations, etc. Yeah, I don't think that the diplomatic performance was good in this case either with the Nikol Pashinyan government. You could see that there had not been any effective outreach to either Russia or CSTO or most other places. Of course, you have individual ambassadors, you have individual people who actively work, but overall diplomatic structure was never there in Armenia. Effective diplomatic structure that sort of generated outcomes. In Azerbaijan, it was only slightly better, and considering that they have expended a lot more resources on it, I don't think what they have accomplished could be considered a success. I mean, considering that just yesterday or day before yesterday, Ilham Aliyev called many of his diplomats traitors and basically threatened them with jail and accusing them of treason. It's hard to see any kind of successful picture in either side as far as diplomatic effort. Yeah, I mean, the Armenian government didn't do well, but Azerbaijani government, I think, did a lot worse, if anything.
Asbed Kotchikian, do you have an assessment of the Armenian government response and readiness in this sphere? For instance, how would you view the responses by the various top government representatives? For example, the Prime Minister, his wife Ana Hakobian, and others. We know the opposition did not care for Ana Hakobian's call for peace to the Azeris.
Right. I would concur with what Emil said earlier. I mean, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed person is a king kind of a situation. With Azerbaijan spending so much effort and money on PR, I think they're more tuned into the PR warfare. There's also one other thing to keep in mind, and that is the idea that if you're victorious, and overall, if we were look at the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, Armenian side came victorious, so they would have less incentive to basically do the PR war. Now, there's also, I have come across the perspective, oh yeah, well, what do we need? Why do we need to do anything? We have already won the conflict. And unfortunately, this is not the 21st century warfare, the cyber warfare or the information warfare. In terms of readiness, I would say, surprisingly, as much as I have been following, Armenian side was ready, and as Emil mentioned as well, they've been building it up in the Tavush area and so on. So military readiness is there. Overall responses, I think, for local consumption, internal consumption, I think it was a weak reaction on the Armenian side. Even the prime minister's call, prime minister's Pashinyan's sort of interviews or statements and so on were very weak. And as far as Ana Hakobian's called for peace and so on and so forth. It was mostly at time of war. I mean, these things do not work. I mean, she's been advocating. One thing that we have to mention, at least keep in mind, is that Anna Agopyan has been consistent in that. I mean, she's been talking about peace and women for peace and so on and so forth. But in the context where things have escalated so much, I think it might have been redundant, or it was redundant.
So maybe I can jump in. I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but also, the response from the CSTO is somewhat concerning in this case, mainly because Armenia is a member of the CSTO and Azerbaijan isn't. And in the past, there have been cases where the leadership of the CSTO has made statements that somewhat at least favored Armenia. In this case, the statements were completely neutral. And we can trace this back to a couple of years ago when Pashinyan first came to power and launched the case against Yuri Khachaturov, who was at that point the general secretary of the CSTO. And a lot of people said that was not a very prudent step, because there was an Armenian in charge of that organization, and that would have been significantly benefiting Armenia. And by launching that case, they ended up basically creating a reason to remove him from office. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, one reason why I feel like there's been a little bit of a failure on the side of diplomacy in general over the past couple of years is because when Pashinyan came to power, he sort of said that we're going to start from a new starting point. We're going to establish a new starting point, and we're not going to follow the steps of the previous administrations. And in doing so, I feel like he for one thing I feel like they kind of severed the continuity in Armenian diplomacy, and the other thing is, in the next few months, there was a lot of attempts at optimization of government, and under that guise, I feel like a lot of very experienced individuals in various government organizations were let go. And that's why I feel like we're seeing a little bit of inexperience in diplomacy at this stage.
Interesting. We do have a chance to talk more about CSTO, but Asbed Bedrosyan, do you have something to say about this?
Well, it's more of a question to the panel. Concerning the CSTO's response, at this point, what is a reasonable expectation on the part of Armenia from its CSTO partners, knowing all the economic entanglements they have with Azerbaijan? For example, Kazakhstan or Russia or Belarus, who have deep investments, interdependencies with Azerbaijan. Can we really expect them to have unilateral statements in support of Armenia? Emil, what do you think?
Yes, I don't think we can expect unilateral statements from them, but CSTO position is usually very much Russia's position. And in this case, I think damage was done with the case against Yuri Khachaturov, and in general, overall, the nervousness that was caused by the Armenian Revolution, nervousness that was caused and is still being caused in Russia over that, and that's kind of part of the cost there, transition cost. But returning to what Alan said, I think there is a lot of continuity, as a matter of fact, in Armenia's policy. I would say in terms of foreign policy, it's if it's not 100% continuity, it's close to that. And if anything, because of those worries that the way Pashinyan came to power, that it generated with Russia, and also the case against Kocharian, the attempt that generated, in the case against Yuri Khachaturov, all of that sort of pushed Pashinyan to show his super loyalty to Russia and sending that symbolic political kind of contingent to Syria, and not participating in NATO exercises that Armenia used to participate in. Serge Sargsyan was president, all those things, and not sort of reaching out to the West all that much. All of those things were done to kind of to mend that relationship with Russia and the worries that Russia had. But reality is the diplomatic outreach to Russia is still very weak, as it was before. I cannot say it was good under 𝐶𝐶. It was terrible, and it remains terrible. In terms of if we compare the last time there was a major fighting in Tavush, this was in September 2015. I don't know if you remember, there was a bombardment, mortar bombardment of area closer to Noyemberyan, actually, not in the same area of Tavush. CSTO did issue a statement and did condemn Azerbaijan, or at least took sides with Armenia. So the expectation would have been to get a statement like that rather than the statement that was generated. And of course, the reason there is that difference, I would say, is twofold. On the one hand, it was clearly that Azerbaijan was clearly an aggressor in 2015, and relations were much better and more sort of on a positive trend because Armenia just joined the Eurasian Union. So there were some issues there, and there was overall worry about Azerbaijan sort of pushing the envelope and getting closer to potential large-scale confrontation. Today, I think there is not as much worry about that in Russia, and I think it relates to overall sense of weakness that Ilham Aliyev is projecting right now, and also the fact that the relationship is not that great, and Russians don't like to be surprised. They hated the fact that they were surprised that 𝐶𝐶 resigned. He never told them that he was resigning. And I'm sure Armenian government wasn't in a close contact with Russia about what was going on this time around militarily. So you need to kind of have those channels and develop those channels. It takes years to develop channels, but I don't think they're working that well, or at least I don't see any evidence of that. One other aside I would like to add, we mentioned Yuri Khachaturov in all of this, but the irony is that the officer in charge of this fighting that just occurred in Tavush and Shamshadin is Yuri Khachaturov's son, Grigory Khachaturov, who is the commander of Armenian Army's 3rd Corps, which is based in that area in Tavush. And there is a lot of continuity when it comes to the military and also the diplomatic corps. And even though there were charges filed against his father, he remains commander of the corps. He was appointed under 𝐶𝐶 in 2016, and there's unanimous approval of his performance.
And Emil, on this CSTO topic, just one more question quickly, and we can move on to the next question. My common sense question is, if you know that the CSTO is going to refuse your request, or any kind of request, why would you send a request? It appears that there was some kind of a communication that prompted an emergency session of the CSTO, or prompted the CSTO secretary 𝐫𝐫𝐨𝐶 to initiate that. Then it was abruptly cancelled, and then we see this weak condemnation of both sides. This equivocal statement. You must have access to the diplomatic corps of all these countries. You should be able to negotiate with them beforehand, before broaching this topic at an international or multilateral sort of forum like CSTO. What are your thoughts on that?
When you have a fast-paced development happening, when you have a fast-paced escalation happening, you're bound to have miscommunication. You're bound to have missteps, especially on the diplomatic front. It's normal. So I don't know exactly the sequence of events diplomatically, whether Armenia actually requested holding that session, or whose initiative it was, if it was communicated properly or what. Clearly, it's the overall picture of Armenia CSTO interaction in this case was not satisfactory and was questionable. But it depends on what motive is, and what the other developments are happening, and in case just in case they might want to have this issue raised, just in case things will get worse or things get more difficult. I can't make a definitive statement whether they should have talked to everybody before they requested something, because there's just sometimes no time when you have a fast-paced process happening. But yeah, the questions are there. But the bottom line, I think, what this situation has demonstrated is that Armenian military capacity has continued to improve in the last couple of years. I think this is primarily the function of what was prepared before there was a change of government in Armenia in 2018, and all of the lessons learned from 2016 and all of the technological advances made as far as precision weaponry and fighting precision weaponry. So all of those advances were made, but I think credit should also be given to Pashinyan that he did not interfere with the military in the way that he's interfered in the law enforcement and the judiciary up to now, and it sort of showed that Armenia has a very decent military capacity.
Yeah, since you mentioned your assessment, actually, let Asbed go ahead.
There was one report that we read, Hovig, that indicated that the emergency session that was called by the CSTO, and we don't know if that was called by Armenia, requested by Armenia or not, but it was canceled following intense lobbying by Azerbaijan, I believe.
Let's link that report for our listeners. Since you mentioned your assessment of Armenia's military capacity or military capabilities today, I think it's worthwhile to remember what happened in 2016 when, after the fighting, 4 high-ranking army officials were sacked, including a general responsible for military intelligence. Now, I say this because in one day we were able to Armenia was able to take out General Polat Gashimov, who is the Chief of Staff, Chief of Missile Troops, and Artillery of the 3rd Army Corps in Azerbaijan, who was responsible for fighting on that side. So do you think this is an indication of actually success, not just in technology, but also our military intelligence capability?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to imagine that this was an accidental event. And if we go back to the sequence of the situation, what we had in 2016 is a very robust response to an attack. Yes, the initial goal of the Azerbaijani side was not clear, and that was the failure of intelligence. There was also, I think, some failure as far as military, some of the weaponry preparedness, etc., and the communication. So the 3 officials that were sacked were actually in charge of intelligence, communications, and armaments. And 2 of them actually have been reinstated now, and one of them was reinstated by Serge Sargsyan at the time. So what I was going to say is that in terms of the way the fighting went on this time, what was different is that you could see more technical sophistication on the Armenian part, but also you could see a much more politically initiative-driven response. So if we look at the way events evolved in 2016, or generally how this sort of small escalations had evolved in the past, since early 2000s or early 2010s, I'm sorry, like 2012, you had basically Armenia take a position of de-escalation and not risking additional escalation, not risking additional casualties. In this case, this was a different approach. You could see that after the first day of fighting, between July 12th, July 13th, Ilham Aliyev came out and said that, we punished them, everything cool, and they started to relax. And then several hours after that, the Armenian side hit the general. So you could see that Armenian side escalated and, wanted to send a message to Aliyev that they're ready to do some more fighting. So the difference was both in the technological aspects and also sort of the mental aspect and the way the political leadership reacted to the situation.
Okay. Asbed Kotchikian, do you have any comments on this?
I mean, Emil covered it extensively. I think, the 2016 war, especially, I mean, the Armenian army readiness itself has been increased, and they've been prepared for this in terms of reconnaissance, drones, and so on and so forth. So both intelligence and preparedness have been there, and it's not that they were caught off guard. So I think all of those that Emil talked about in much detail, I think showed that the Armenian army is ready and prepared and has the capacity to react.
Yeah, it's hard to be caught off guard when you're the one initiating. So when you have the initiative, you're rarely caught off guard. So
I think there's also Emil mentioned this, but there was also a very big difference between what happened in April 2016, where it was a wide-scale attack on several different fronts, as opposed to these skirmishes, which have been largely localized in one area. But yeah, one commonality that I learned about recently is that there's this Yashma, like a special forces brigade in Azerbaijan, that was handily defeated both in April 2016 by Armenian armed forces, and also I think yesterday on July 16th they also deployed the same forces which had somewhat been decimated in 4 years ago, but they probably built it back up and used them again. But again, the Armenian side completely destroyed them. One other thing I wanted to mention is Emil mentioned that there were 3 people that were sacked right after the April War, and one of them was the chief of intelligence. His name is Areg Danagoulian, and he was later appointed as an advisor to 𝐁𝐸𝐴 Pashinyan.
Yeah, well, before he was appointed advisor to 𝐁𝐸𝐴 Pashinyan, he was appointed by Serge Sargsyan defense attaché in Moscow, which is a very key position as far as Armenia-Russian relations. So he was he was brought back by Serge Sargsyan, not by 𝐁𝐸𝐴 Pashinyan. But of course, 𝐁𝐸𝐴 Pashinyan appointed him as an advisor in part because he gave testimony critical of Robert Kotchikian and was the only military officer to do that. So he was rewarded politically for that.
I think we should go on to the next question. I mean, you specialize in Azerbaijani politics, so this question is going to go to you as well. What are the dynamics driving the domestic political scene in Baku? Ilham Aliyev just fired his longtime foreign minister, Mamediyarov, for quote-unquote ineffective negotiations over Karabakh. There was a crowd, I think the estimates are around 30,000, demonstrating in Baku, demanding an end to negotiation and quarantine, and demanding war on Armenia. What is going on? Can you let us know?
Well, if there is any virtue to Ilham Aliyev, is that he realizes that a large-scale conflict is just not a good thing. I mean, it's not a good thing from perspective of humanitarian perspective, how many people would be affected, and it's not a good thing for him politically. So that understanding in that sort of sense is very important. It's been proven. He's been president for the 17 years. He's been building up military, investing money in the military, but there is understanding that both countries are small enough to bruise each other substantially, but not achieve any kind of major breakthrough in terms of territorial control or like total victory. So he understands that this thing is going to go on. It's a long term, it's a marathon, and so his approach has been to kind of find just enough of the low-risk engagements and engage in them and sort of find some kind of tangible way to gain a little bit of territory or a little bit of a political advantage. And that's what he's been engaged in. And after today's, this week's events, he was sort of saying, basically making statements again, reflecting sort of lack of confidence in his country's ability to fight. He mentioned something like, only 150 people or I don't know, whatever silly number is ready to enroll in the military, which is obviously a lie. But the reason he said it was to sort of claim that, it's not him who's reluctant to fight, but his people are reluctant to fight. And then, he talked about needing to, again, increase the military spending. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, how much more money can you spend on buying stuff? I mean, they bought pretty much everything they could potentially buy. And that approach sort of shows that. And another, this latest sort of scapegoating of Elmar Mamediyarov. I met Elmar Mamediyarov when he was working in Washington before he became foreign minister. And my understanding is that the reason he became foreign minister is because when Ilham Aliyev would come here before he became president, would go to, I don't know, Atlantic City or some other places like that, and Elmar Mamediyarov would take him around because he was the deputy ambassador, and became friends, and they maybe knew each other from before too. So when he became president, he brought Elmar Mamedov, who was just appointed ambassador to Italy at the time as the foreign minister. Him loyally helped shape a better image for his regime, for all the trying to cover up for all the nasty things they've been doing, killing their own people primarily, and putting them in jail and torturing them. So he had been helping him, and all of a sudden now he's like declaring him the fall guy for lack of progress on the Karabakh negotiations. I mean, it's just it just shows that he's not there. Ilham Aliyev is in a very vulnerable position.
Asbed Kotchikian, what are your thoughts on this? And also, if I can just add an additional question. So there's this theory that no protests in Azerbaijan can occur without the government's okay. Do you believe that? And what was the motivation for allowing 30,000 people to storm Baku, to do a protest in Baku and storm the parliament, some of them? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you have...
They can have...
I thought I was still talking.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
One of you.
Okay, so I think, they can have demonstrations in Baku. The problem is how many people can get out there, and how are they treated by the police. Yes, the overall thing is that this kind of a large-scale demonstrations with the police not using excessive force raises some questions as to why now, and why this kind of a gathering. The problem is, or the question is, I think Aliyev, as Emil mentioned, he's in a weak position. He's trying to find a scapegoat in the form of the foreign minister, but at the same time, he's trying to rally the people who probably are also frustrated with the lockdown or the COVID-19 and probably some economic aspect, to redirect their attention into a more nationalist rhetoric, to be able to divert their attention. So to a large extent, I think the demonstrations, but it's also a risky game, Hovik. I think to a large extent, it could always get out of hand. You can always start a fire, but you might not be able to control it. So I think that is also one thing to keep in mind.
Emil, I'll let you follow up on that, but also tell us what you know about Ceyhun Bayramov, who is Mamedov's replacement.
Well, let me tell you this. So, first of all, this was not a demonstration. What happened is, there were news that the martyrs, shahids, were being brought to Baku. So there has been a tradition in the past number of years when bodies of soldiers or officers killed in the fighting with Armenians would be brought. There would be gatherings of youth, usually sort of shouting nationalist slogans, going to the cemetery, participating in the wake, religious ceremony associated. So that's what it was. It was just much larger because this was in Baku. And, they were expecting the general's body. So this was a big kind of event. So people gathered and they just kind of walked. And the original intention was to walk to the main military cemetery, which happens to be right next to the parliament. And so it turned from the sort of a march that is, has occurred before. And in Baku, they had a big march during 2016. So it's, of course, as a sense of anger, it sort of turned into kind of a protest, and people stuck around, went into parliament. Some Azerbaijani colleagues are suggesting that there was some sort of provocation happening because they actually saw deputy head of Azerbaijan KGB and Ilham Aliyev's cousin, so he was there with the protesters inside the parliament building. So I don't know if he had to just check things out, or he was there, he was the one to open the door. I don't know, but it seemed like there was an element of government presence there. But of course, there is a realization that you can't control this anger. It's just when it spills out, and Azerbaijani sort of repertoire of political action from the past number of decades, is known that those sort of big groups of young angry men can create some physical harm and physical damage. And in this case, they were able to kind of, and as a matter of fact, it seemed totally uncontrollable in terms of people moving around, because, like I said, it started as something and then turned into something else. And they actually, the few people who either showed up with sort of opposition identities or opposition flags or something, they were kind of shoved aside. And sort of the main core of this protesters or participants, they didn't want opposition there, because they know when you associate with the opposition, you're going to get beaten up and you go into jail. So, it still happened, and there was still some beating up and some going to jail, and there are people getting arrested right now. So, especially anyone who did any kind of live broadcast of the protest and live broadcast of those things. So this was not a demonstration in the way we understand a demonstration. There was not an announcement called that we're going to gather in front of the parliament. No, there was a march towards the cemetery that turned into a protest. Said 𝐀𝐬𝐻 𝐊𝐴𝐵𝐺 knows that a very, very sensitive man, and he's very, very concerned that he looks that he's coming out of this in a damaged state, and I think he will try to find a way to sort of augment it, both in terms of additional attacks, find a way to maybe attack a senior Armenian official, military official, or something like that. Especially in Karabakh, someone. I mean, it was clear that this would be the next sort of the next page in the Armenian-Azerbaijani confrontation. That now that both sides have precision weaponry, which they didn't have before, and have the much better intelligence gathering capability, that they would try to zero in and target a senior official, because of course that creates kind of a big political impact. And you just had a big example of 𝐾𝐬𝐻 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝐺 being killed by U.S. forces in Iraq. So I think that was actually in preparation. It's just my hunch, of course, but that something like that was probably in preparation by Azerbaijani side. It's just the Armenian side can preempted that too.
Well, we're, I think, almost out of time, but so I think we'll have the last closing comments. I wish we talked about Georgia and Ukraine and reaction of Guam, but I think it's going to be for a future episode unless I wants to say something quick. But Asbed Kotchikian.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, we talked a lot about the domestic and the military component, but the international component, I think I didn't want to say this earlier, but one of the other reasons that the Azerbaijani side, I think, intended with this aggression, with this attack, is also to test the international waters and to see what kind of reaction they're going to get. And the international reaction has been at best lukewarm. Rather, it was. I would even go further and say it was like completely below the radar. Now, in the case of Guam, don't forget that Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova organization, Azerbaijan holds the presidency of Guam today. So when you look at the statement coming out of Guam, and then you look at the individual statements coming out of Georgian, Ukrainian, and Moldovan foreign ministries or the president's office, you could see that there is a discrepancy, at least some discrepancy, where they are not uniformly among countries. Obviously, all three have issues with separatism, so territorial integrity is very important for them. That's what they keep reiterating. And among these three countries, Georgia actually has a lot at stake because the clash is only 20 kilometers, about 18 from their border. So from that perspective, I think the international community, be that the OSCE and others, we already talked about the CSTO, they actually were, acted very miserably. And this might also come under the larger umbrella about the Azerbaijani diplomatic quote-unquote success. So that's what I wanted to mention. I think it's important to keep that in mind.
I think one more thing we had to discuss was the nuclear power plant threat. And I know Areg Danagoulian will talk about the tactical aspects of nuclear power plant, but in terms of political aspect of it, I mean, this was a major gift, diplomatic gift to Armenia. And I hope they, use it because, this is just the most unusual type of threat, And
but Emil, sorry to interrupt, but the thing is that the Azerbaijani threat came in after non-official Armenian side, people on social media threatened that they're going to bomb the Mingechaur dam and so on.
Sorry, but those people on social media, they're not armed with missiles. Azerbaijani statement came from the defense ministry that's armed with missiles.
Emil, that's not what I meant. Don't preempt me. Just 1 second. I'm saying that from that perspective, when the tensions are high, when you see something like that, even if it's coming from Joe Schmo, you would end up taking it as seriously. And the response from the Azerbaijani side, yes, I agree with you that there is no real danger. And actually, it would take a nuclear weapon to blow up the dam that could stand a nuclear weapon. That we understand. But I think it's very important.
No. Wait a second. I don't agree that there is no danger. I agree that there is danger. Those guys are armed with missiles that can do it. So when that threat is made, that should be a major issue. The fact that it's being ignored, I think, is a very, very foolhardy.
This is the over response. That's what I want to mean. I mean, Emil might have missed my point, but what I'm saying is that the Azerbaijani over responded instead of actually having another, Ali or Hussein Shmo from Baku, responding to this. The Minister of Defense took on the responsibility upon itself to make an official threat. And yes, I agree, Emil. They have the capacity and so on and so forth. But that's not the question. Is that at times of this heightened sort of tension, even a small comment made by 12-year-old kid might be taken seriously on the social media. We know the power of the social media at that sense. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, which we will discuss with Areg as well in more detail.
I think that I agree with Emil. This is a huge political gift to Armenia, essentially a threat for state-sponsored nuclear terrorism on the part of Azerbaijan. But the other point that is interesting to notice from a couple of points earlier in this discussion is how even a social media rumor by a few people can take a complete spin on political affairs and generate such a state response from Azerbaijan, where a couple of people, for example, on social media are claiming that we will destroy a dam, and Azerbaijan officially comes back with a nuclear threat.
To be clear, there have been multiple people in Armenia that I've heard, at least in the past, repeat this threat, and so I don't think it's just social media rumor, but also I don't think it was acting current officials, which is what is happening on the Azerbaijani side. In the most recent threat came from from someone who was the defense minister of Armenia 20 years ago, which is ridiculous to react to.
Yeah, I don't know if he actually used that threat. I mean, the idea of attacking the hydropower plant or the dam, I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. There is not a weapon, and that would actually require a nuclear weapon to kind of breach that dam. But the most of the commentary on this is from people who are not very familiar. Even some former defense officials are not very familiar with technology, present weapons technology, and also the actual dam there and the power plant. So these are very different things. The dam attacking the dam will not cause the damage that attacking the nuclear power plant can cause. This is very, very different things.
And with this, I think we have to wrap up. As the fighting and rhetoric between Armenia and Azerbaijan was heating up towards the end of the week, Azerbaijan made an audacious threat to attack the Armenian nuclear power plant at Metsamor using its arsenal of ballistic missiles. We were curious about the technical aspects of any potential danger this threat, if materialized, would cause, so we asked Areg Danagoulian, Associate Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT, to chime in. Let's listen to a segment of that discussion between Asbed Kotchikian and Areg. The full interview will be published as a separate podcast shortly after the release of this one. This is Friday, July 17th, and we're having a discussion with Areg Danagoulian and Asbed Kotchikian on issues surrounding the Armenian nuclear power plant.
Good afternoon. This is Asbed Kotchikian, and my guest here today for our conversation is Areg Danagoulian. Hello, Areg. How are you doing today?
Hello, Asbed. Very good to be here.
Thank you. So, Areg, I want to have a conversation today in the larger context of the latest flare-up and clashes on the border, but specifically talking about a statement made by a representative from the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry, spokesman of the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry, threatening to hit the nuclear power plant in Armenia, the Metsamor nuclear power plant. This is not the first time that is happening, but in the context of the escalation, I just wanted to get your take on how safe, to start with, is the Metsamor nuclear power plant structurally, operationally, strategically, especially considering that in the 1970s, when it was built as a Soviet installation, are there any fortifications left from that time that could be used?
Yeah. So I think two questions there to separate. One of them is safety, and the second one is security. So safety in terms of the stability of the nuclear power plant to accidental kind of circumstances, right? So the accidents, excursions, etc. And the second one, how well is it defended from intentional malicious attacks, right?
Right.
So there is a big tendency in the West and in the public that maybe is not familiar with nuclear reactor technology, to sort of to sort of lump together all the Soviet reactors, and they make associations between, say, Metsamor and Chernobyl. But those are vastly different technologies. The Metsamor nuclear power plant is a pressurized water reactor, very similar in its basic operation to the Western-style pressurized water reactors, the ones that we run in the United States, in France, etc. It does have one significant shortcoming, and it has to do with the fact that in Soviet Union, when they built the nuclear power plants, they did not build something that's called a containment building. It's essentially this big concrete cupola that are like the hallmark of nuclear power plants in the West that protect the plant from external attacks. They are supposed to withstand a hit by a jet, by a fighter, by an airplane, essentially, and also they contain any kind of possible radiation release. So the Metsamor does not have this important feature.
Okay. And in terms of security, what you mentioned, if I got it correctly, was the safety aspect. What about the security aspect in terms of preventing any such attacks? Usually in many different countries, whenever you have a nuclear power plant, there would be cordon off area around it, sometimes even surface to air missiles to protect any attacks. Is there any, to your knowledge, any such things with the Metsamor nuclear power plant?
So I do not know specifically about surface-to-air anti-aircraft batteries in nearby. Obviously, there is a general kind of generic security system, but at issue right now, we're not talking about some soldiers kind of coming and occupying it. We're talking about possibility of Azerbaijan using its short-range ballistic missiles. They have two types of ballistic missiles. They have the LoRa missiles that they acquired from Israel that have the what's called circular error probable of 30 meters. They can strike, with a 50% probability, they can strike an object 30 meters peak. And then they have also Polonez Belarusian short-range ballistic missiles of a range of approximately 300 kilometers, with 200 to 300 kilometers, which could also allow it to strike the reactor building of the nuclear power plant. And essentially the danger is specifically in that if they were to carry out such an attack, the outcomes would be quite dramatic. In that if that were to cause a loss of control by the local staff over the reactor, or even worse, a loss of coolant accident. The reactor would go into something that's called a meltdown. Okay, it would probably not. I mean, we're entertaining some horrible scenarios here. It would perhaps be not as bad as Chernobyl, but it would be probably as bad as, say, Fukushima or something like that. And would really result in a major release of radiation. And at this point, the question is, well, what if something like that happens? Okay. Keith, the important thing to understand is if you look at the radiation map after Chernobyl accident, you see that it covered most of Europe. Like half of Europe was actually a territory about 2,000 by 2,000 kilometers was contaminated by radiation from Chernobyl. So if something similar were to happen in Metsamor, we're looking essentially at the radiation contamination that would. Obviously, it would affect Armenia. It would heavily affect Turkey. The reason being is because the Metsamor power plant is within 10 kilometers, a very short distance from the Turkish border. And the prevalent winds in that area, which are important in terms of where the radiation goes and where the nuclear fallout is deposited, most of the radiation would be driven into Turkey. Possibly a lot of the Middle East would be covered. Possibly Balkans and Eastern Europe would be covered. And of course, Caucasus would be covered. That means would be affected. That means Georgia and Azerbaijan itself, right? So it becomes sort of clear that an intentional attack against Metsamor, especially such a kind of direct kind of a destructive attack, would harm Armenia, but would also harm tremendously Azerbaijan itself, both in terms of environment as well as economy, because in that condition, economies have to come to standstill, but also politically. This would be like an enormous cost to Azerbaijan.
That's great to know. I mean, in a way, they would be shooting themselves in the foot or in the head or in the arm, but they will be self-harming themselves as well if such an attack would happen. But I want to come back to something that you mentioned, Areg, earlier in terms of the missile attacks. About a year and a half ago, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, they actually targeted Saudi pipelines with, a number of targeted drones, large in quantity. Is there such a possibility in terms of attacking the nuclear power plant? And I want to add something here. What is the target that we're talking about? Is there like a specific target on the nuclear power plant that needs to be targeted? How big, how small are those targets to have a significant damage and radiation?
So it really depends on what kind of drone technology Azeris would have, right? They could, in principle, try to launch something from Nakhichevan. But they would need drones that would operate a distance of 30 kilometers. For example, if they were to acquire the Bayraktar, ground attack drones that Turkey has used very effectively in Syria against the Syrian forces, they could use that to harm the power plant. But at that point, we're talking about fairly small warheads. We're talking about 5 to 10 kilograms warheads, explosives. The LoRa and the Polonaise warheads, they are measured in hundreds of kilograms. These are major, huge, these are fairly large explosive warheads that can cause significant amount of damage. But then the question is that the Azeris don't have to attack the reactor and cause this catastrophic event. They can do other things, right? They can do something that is less catastrophic, but will, say, damage Armenia's economy significantly without causing a radiation release. For example, they could attack the nuclear power plant's ability to produce electricity without actually causing this loss of coolant, accidents that cause radiation release and things like that. Now, if you do something like that, they could attack, let's say, the switchyard. They could attack some of the electrical power components at the nuclear power plant. So two things. First of all, yes, that would be beneficial to them and harmful to Armenia because essentially Armenia would lose 40% of its energy. And if that were to happen during wintertime, that would be even worse. But fixing an electrical switchyard, power equipment, is that, that can be done maybe in a few months. Okay, so Armenia for maybe a month or two would be out of electricity or would lose significant amount of its power output, would damage its economy to some degree. But again, that would not be catastrophic. We're not talking about. But what is important is that any kind of attack. The question is that political component of this is very important. Any kind of attack at near a plant, let alone at a plant, even if you just blow up some kind of a little shed next to the power plant. Okay, is going to have a huge reverberations throughout the world, because not for technological reasons, but for political and policy reasons, any kind of an explosion in anywhere near the plant that is intentional is going to have an enormous political repercussions for Azerbaijan. Because hey, maybe you were trying to attack the shed, but maybe you could have hit the reactor itself. And even a small chance that such an attack could result in the kind of accidents that I described earlier, okay, would be seen as an unacceptable risk to the world community, okay, not because they love Armenia, but because of themselves, because they don't want to face the risk of being
self-preservation,
exactly. So now, these are all rational arguments. Basically, if we were judging from point of view of rationality, even a minor attack on Metsamor would be highly the value of it would be completely outweighed by the costs, the political costs for Azerbaijan. But again, this assumes a rational treatment rational approach by Azeris. There's no guarantee that they will pursue such an approach.
Okay. My conversation partner today was Areg Danagoulian. We were talking about Armenia's Metsamor's nuclear power plant. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Areg, for your time.
We're nearing the end of this week's episode. And before we sign off, we just wanted to have a brief discussion about the state of the media, which we wanted to have a permanent place in our podcast. And there were several significant events happening this week that we should discuss. Of course, with the conflagration on the border, there was a lot of interest from reporters to go and report on the scene. One incident I remember is a reporter from one of the media uploading a video from one of the villages, and there could be bombs being heard in the background. This was, I believe, the reaction from the military to this upload on Facebook was to ban all media from entering the zone of the fighting. So I wanted to get your point of view on this, and in general, I have Asbed Bedrosian and Asbed Kotchikian here. It's just the three of us, but wanted to get your thoughts on this, gentlemen, and if any other things you could add that you've noticed, on this matter this week.
This is Asbed Kotchikian. I have two things to point out. One is it was very interesting to see the self-censorship that the media imposed on itself, obviously self-imposed censorship, probably from a sense of responsibility, but also in terms of not talking about events as they are happening, which I think is quite a responsible attitude. And then on the other hand, I was also fascinated to see the amount of, while it's not media, but the amount of misinformation and disinformation on the social media in terms of reporting about the number of casualties, about issues that the Armenians took 2, 3, 4 positions, and so on and so forth. All in all, I was nicely surprised, actually, overall, with the self-censorship aspect, because it shows some level of journalistic responsibility, as well as a sense of respecting their national security.
Asbed Bedrosian, any thoughts on this? And while you're at this, why do you keep publishing Azeri news on Facebook?
Hovig, what struck me during this week about Azeri news is how ready they were to get off the ground with their propaganda and immediately reach out to all of their friend organizations to publish one-sided unilateral statements. For example, I saw that the Organization of Islamic Countries, the Turkic countries, Turkey, Pakistan, on multiple occasions, by the way, all of them immediately within a day to a day and a half had statements ready and coming out. It was like a juggernaut machine. That was surprising, and it told me basically this was a ready-made situation. All they had to do was make a few phone calls and get all these things off the ground and printed. Amazing. As far as your question about Groong and Azeri news, we believe in informing people. We certainly don't want to publish Azeri news, Turkish news, as if it was some kind of objective non-anti-Armenian news, just like something from France or something from Armenia or something from Russia or Georgia. In these two countries specifically, and maybe we could even also include Pakistan and very one-sided countries, we want to know what these countries are printing about us, what they're thinking about us, but we want to denote them very clearly. You see that we always put Azerbaijani press, Turkish press, to make sure that the reader knows that they are reading from a specific certain source, and we all know that they have a certain angle on this. I think it's very important to know what they're doing, because if we don't read it, we're probably the only ones who are not reading it. This information is out there all over the place on the internet, and people are printing these and approaching their representatives, their congressmen, their senators, or their governments in their countries, and lobbying for anti-Armenian activities. If we don't know about this, we're the only losers.
So basically, know thy opponent attitude. Isn't that so, Asbed Bedrosian?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Asbed Kotchikian, just I wanted to clarify. So you're actually impressed by the amount of self-censorship in the media,
right?
Do you see Armenian news or news organizations in Armenia doing something similar like we do on Groong, which is publish Azeri news and say, hey, this is Azeri news? Do you believe that level of, that attitude of know thy enemy is pertinent in Armenia as well, or is being exercised?
Well, I think it is pertinent, absolutely, Hovik. And I think, and I know for sure, for a fact, that a lot of scholars, especially from Oriental Studies departments and so on, they do follow Azeri and Turkish news and base their analysis on that, which is what any scholar or any analyst would do. But when it comes to the media, I personally, overall, my overall assessment of the state of the Armenian media is quite let's say, hesitant and skeptical, mostly because the fact that sensationalism sells. And more often than not, it is much easier for newspapers to take posts from Facebook and run it as news rather than have an in-depth analysis or even fact check. So from that perspective, I do not see that kind of that level of consciousness in overall Armenian media, not just in Armenia, but even in the diaspora.
I think that's a very interesting thing you said, Asbed. The habit of basically taking Facebook or Twitter posts and repackaging them as articles. There's pervasive doing that right now. If you look at various of our media sources, they basically take a reasonably well thought out position, but which is made in a Facebook post, and they basically package it as an article and they publish it. And to your question, Hovig, yes, that is of course happening, that they repackage an anti-Armenian or a different sourced article, and sometimes you do not know. You can't quite tell that it came from an anti-Armenian source. It's very interesting that this is happening we're talking right now within an hour or two after Margarita Simonian posted a very anti-Armenian government, not anti-Armenian nation, anti-Armenian government posting, which is going to have wide resonance. But Harabarak basically took that post and packaged it and put it out there for the media to read as an Armenian article.
But I also want to build upon that aspect in a sense that you have a situation where an official statement being made on Facebook, it's an official statement, an individual or whatnot. The newspapers, instead of posting it as is, which is sort of like also the practice on Facebook when you just post something that you read without actually giving your opinion. So how am I supposed to know if you agree with this or you're against it and so on? So the analysis part is always missing. So it's okay to post things from take things from Facebook for especially official statement, but the analysis is always missing in terms of the print media in Armenia.
I'm going to come back with a question to Hovig, because he is very keen and aware about these things, that in the Armenian world, Hovig, would you volunteer some of those statistics that you had about the Armenians being very highly internet-oriented in their news and media participation? For example, the number of YouTube channels that we have, or the number of people who follow these YouTube channels, is much more than, for example, the Georgians or the Azeris or many of our neighbor countries.
It'd be worthwhile to look at the comparative analysis, but looking at the latest CRRC poll, I believe the number of Armenians who say that social media is a source of news for them, or a major source of news, is close to 80% or 84%, if I remember exactly. Meanwhile, around 91% or more than 90% say TV. So social media and the internet have reached, I believe, the threshold of TV in terms of adoption or penetration. And that can be seen anecdotally on Facebook as well, where that's where more, I believe, more pertinent political discussions happen today than anywhere else.
Asbed, do you not think that such a high penetration of social media, so-called news outlets, reaching the levels of television, is a little bit of a concern, because they are not as curated? Sometimes it's very difficult to figure out the source and the funding of these outlets. What do you think about that?
It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I think in many cases, I know, for instance, if you look at the case of Russia, there have been studies recently that a lot of young people in Russia, they don't even follow the news at all because they know that it's all controlled by the government. And in recent years, for instance, Navalny, the Russian opposition figure, he actually ended up being quite popular on Facebook and YouTube because a lot of people were following that. So It depends on the environment, but then it also raises, again, coming from an American background, it also raises the issue of the freedom of speech. The problem is people to be educated, informed, and trained enough to see what news is basically propaganda, what news is just an opinion, or what news is fake news. That's one of the biggest problems. So it is really a double-edged sword. While the quality of the news programs on TV have been getting better and better in Armenia in terms of the analysis and so on, but a high level of politicization is also there. So my question, or my rhetorical question, would be, what difference would it make if the politicized opinions are being broadcasted on TV or on Facebook?
So that's, I think, a very heavy question to ponder, and we should think about it for a week and come back next week. So let's wrap up today's episode, and just can you recall anything that we discussed today that was of interest to you and resonated with you, or something that we missed and we should have probably take note of and cover in the future?
I think the conversation that we had with Areg Danagoulian was quite informative and quite to the point, and it demythified a lot of issues, but also explained a lot of issues. And from that perspective, building upon that, I know there were a lot of things because of time constraint we missed out, including that topic. I know that we agree that there should have been more discussion about the energy section in Armenia in general, using renewable energy and so on, or talking about Turkey and Turkey's role in this conflict, but in the wider context. But my hope is that we will end up having more in-depth analysis and podcasts dedicated to each one of these issues to discuss it in more depth.
This is an interesting moment in time as well, because like Asbed said about the energy sector in Armenia, just this last week, I think I saw an article off the top of my head. I think it was an Armen press, that the first solar power plant was funded from European sources. I think the ERDB, I think the European Development Bank, and the European Union had participated in funding approximately about $40 million for an organization to start building a solar power plant. I think this is going to be an area that we explore further. There's going to be the nuclear power plant is going to be shut down permanently in 2036, or that is the plan currently. It's not going to be economically viable to invest $4 to $16 billion to create a new power plant. So it's going to be likely that we look into renewable energy sources. So we should talk more about these solar power plants and other alternatives.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. So, how do we do? We'd love your feedback. You can reach us on the web at groong.org or on our Facebook page by searching for ANN Groong. That's GROONG. Special thanks goes to Laura Osborne for her rendition of 𝐀𝐫𝐞𝐿, which is the theme music for our podcast.